Language was also explored as a means of progress. It had previously been believed that language was merely one of God's gifts to man. For example, the Quran mentions that خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانَ عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانَ, that he created man and he taught him speech. He taught him how to talk. But some historians looked at language acquisition and development as a key component of the evolution of our species. And the study of language and linguistics is important because it allows us to trace back the development of languages, but more importantly, it allows us to decipher and even figure out what more classical languages, or how to understand these more classical antique languages better, and how to decipher many of their riddles and problems. And it's interesting because, for example, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics were solved out of this kind of curiosity to figure out what these ancients had to say and how different this kind of language was compared to our current languages. The general consensus of the time was that language played a key role in civilization, in civilizing a nation, and defining the spirit of its law of nature or manners. In theory, the more civilized a society, the more sophisticated its language would be, and the more refined its morals and behavior. Thus, we see many of the Great World languages, they convey a lot of abstract concepts, and they are able to, in a very concise manner, discuss very sophisticated issues. One measure of how sophisticated and refined a society had become was how respectfully it treated its women. Women were previously considered unworthy of being the subject of historical narrative, but around the late 18th century, women's histories began to be published, such as the history of women from the earliest antiquity, and a handful of women were acknowledged as writers of history themselves, such as Catherine Macaulay, who wrote the epic history of England. Of course, the unfortunate reality is that in many cases, women have been hidden from the historical narrative, or they've been glossed over. And of course, whilst we obviously shouldn't depreciate the value of or not consider the great men of our history, we should absolutely make an effort to include and do due justice to the great women of our history as well, who contributed a lot to the betterment of mankind. And it is not fair to leave out those women, especially who contributed a lot to humanity, and just include the men who contributed a lot to humanity. The progress of society was at the forefront of the work of a group that later became known as religious humanitarians. Religious humanism, of course, would be the difference between religious humanism and secular humanism is secular humanism might view the mankind in and of itself having this kind of value, and that, not on a very perhaps spiritual basis, but perhaps on a more rational basis of man being, the most noble of creatures in its form. But religious humanitarians actually take this to a different degree, where they would emphasize that, especially in the Christian tradition, that God created man in his image, and therefore man is a reflection of the divine. Furthermore, man was given a soul which is sacred, and man's life and his form has been sanctified. Of course, in the Islamic tradition, God says in the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created man in the best of forms. And in the Abrahamic traditions, whether it be Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, there is a teaching of blowing into man from God's soul or God's spirit. Now, of course, theologians would not take this literally, and most religious believers perhaps wouldn't take this literally because it would entail perhaps anthropomorphic qualities, but the meaning behind this is this kind of honor and nobility that God has directly given to mankind. And it's very interesting because in the Quranic narrative, God has made man as a vicegerent of his on the earth. And he is supposed to be the caretaker and the representative of God on his earth. And he granted him knowledge by which he is the most virtuous and the greatest of all creation. And indeed, many philosophers may point out that it is this knowledge and this capacity to reason and be cognizant that gives humanity such an edge over the rest of the animal kingdom. Indeed, God, indeed, whether you say that it is God or the universe or the natural process of evolution, whatever one's opinion may be, it cannot be denied that man has an incredible capacity for, first of all, accumulating knowledge, understanding that knowledge, and then applying that knowledge in the real world to come up with real world solutions. This is why we see the various intellectual breakthroughs throughout mankind's history and the amount of technological progress that we have made. It is this kind of indomitable spirit of mankind to keep on pushing forward and create new inventions and come up with new ideas and develop new systems of thought and contribute to the world, which is really baffling in the grand scale of existence. Nothing like that can be perceived in the rest of the animal kingdom and indeed in the rest of the cosmos. There was a clear correlation between the Enlightenment's concern for the individual human worth and the betterment of the human species and traditional Christian principles that promoted community and goodwill towards others. Indeed, why would it not? As Christ himself said, love your enemies, so that you may attain your Father's kingdom in heaven. Thus, goodness and good treatment of other people has always been an important and emphasized part of the Christian tradition. And when you look at the context in which Jesus came in the Roman Empire at that time, 1/3 of its population was slaves, and it was a very pragmatic, cruel kind of place with a very strong Indo-Aryan warrior culture. But Christ came along and said that it didn't have to be that way, and if we loved one another, we could attain God's kingdom on earth. And indeed, all the major religions sought to bring about the betterment of mankind through certain principles and certain endeavors, and sought to alleviate the suffering of the poor through charity and help bring justice on earth. Thus came the Axial Age around 500 BC, and from that period of time, we saw great figures and prophets such as the Buddha, Confucius, Zoroaster, Christ, culminating arguably in the Prophet Muhammad. And these figures sought to guide mankind to higher principles that would give them spiritual fulfillment and would bring about justice on earth. Rather than theorizing thus the history of progress and hypothesizing on where it would go in the future, as many academics in the ivory towers, in the sort of intellectual ivory towers tend to do, religious humanitarians sought to actively relieve human suffering amongst the urban poor, slaves, prisoners, and children. Religious humanitarians pushed for legal and prison reform and were inspired by rational Enlightenment thinkers focused on education to bring Sunday schools to England. Thus, we see in the Christian world at the time that a movement for the abolishment of slavery came about. And this was based very much on Christian teachings of love, compassion for each other, and bringing about God's kingdom on earth and justice. A specific outcome of this movement was the abolition of slavery in England. In 1774, slavery was made illegal in England. For subsequent decades, a dedicated movement led by William Wilberforce campaigned for the end of the slave trade worldwide. The efforts of Wilberforce and his supporters included evangelical Christians, Methodists, and Quakers were rewarded in 1807 when the slave trade was ended. But it took about 3 decades before slavery as a whole was abolished in the British colonies. Anti-imperialism was also aligned with Enlightenment thought, European engagement with people of colonized or simply exotic lands was routinely criticized by Enlightenment thinkers. Diderot's The History of the Two Indies was highly critical of the behavior of Europeans within the colonies, their treatment of native peoples, and the ownership of slaves. Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant also offered rigorous critiques of aggressive strategies and monopolistic trading in the colonial world.